Welcome back, everybody. We're happy to be joined today by Sarah Troia, the Managing Director of Outcomes AI and Chief Innovation Officer at Project Evidence. Project Evidence just launched the Equitable AI Adoption Framework, and we're looking forward to learning a lot more about it. Welcome to the podcast, Sarah.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Tell us a little bit about Project Evidence, your role there, and the new framework.
Sure. Well, Project Evident was founded about a decade ago out of what the founder, Kelly Fitzsimmons, and I often call productive dissatisfaction. And that dissatisfaction was the way that evidence and data was being used sort of solely as judgment to understand whether or not a program was delivering its outcomes or students were gaining learning, as opposed to really a tool for learning for students, for teachers, for nonprofit managers, administrators. And so we were really interested in changing the way data was being used so that it was, broadening the definition of what information and data could be, and that it was functioning more in an R&D-like capacity, and that was considering equity at every step of the measure. We got involved with AI about 4 or 5 years ago, not because AI in itself was terribly exciting to us, but what we saw is that it was going to be a way to completely change where collection and analysis of data could happen. And that meant that you could do things that looked more like art. You could collect broader data. You could collect lots of more qualitative information, but have analysis of that qualitative information in ways that was highly efficient. So we looked at it as a way to really enable our original vision, and that was going to allow many more people who are on the front line. So whether that's a teacher with a student or an administrator with a teacher, or a nonprofit with a client, a frontline staff person, it was going to allow them to have more information at their fingertips to make better decisions, to customize their engagement with the person who was right in front of them. So that's what got us really excited. However, a couple of years ago, as I mentioned, when we got involved in machine learning first and then AI, this was before the release of generative AI in 22, we found that very few nonprofits and were actually really engaged in using AI. And so we were fortunate enough to have a partnership with the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI. In 23, we did a big survey around philanthropic foundations and nonprofits and school systems and how they were using AI, whether they were using AI. What we found is, not surprisingly perhaps, that education institutions and education-serving nonprofits were much more further ahead in using AI than the rest of the nonprofit sector, but that across the board, 80% felt like they could be using it more, but they really didn't know how. So that's where we stepped in with the development of the Equitable AI Adoption Framework. And this was just one part of sort of a multi-pronged approach of trying to close what we would call like the inspiration gap. How do I actually use AI in a way that's going to drive better outcomes for students, better outcomes for the client that I'm serving? And so we began by sitting down with nonprofits who were serving educational institutions who had already begun their AI journey, who were at varying points on that journey, and really tried to get practical and tactical with them to understand, what does AI adoption actually look like from an implementation perspective on the ground? So that's where we started. We started with the voices of people who were on the ground, both in technology seats and program or curriculum seats, and really talk to them about what they were experiencing and what they were learning. And it was from that shared experience we developed the framework. We also created a series of case studies to highlight some of the aspects of the framework, a series of podcasts. So we try to create different types of materials to speak into different people's learning styles, different people's listening, so they could be inspired by about how AI could possibly be a force multiplier for mission, a force multiplier for outcomes and student achievement.
Yeah, it seems like, that survey and getting those results is, really kind of what motivated you to take the next step. When you kind of, maybe within the survey or like when you started working with people, did you kind of see like maybe they were further ahead or needed more help with, there's different things, right? Just kind of organizing your data so that, you can have generative AI take advantage of that for some reports or fundraising. There's kind of just even basic data security. So you're not putting it in a, like the free version of ChatGPT. Then there's kind of like, the ability to, generate PowerPoints or research reports, which I've helped a few with. Like, are there any particular areas you see people are kind of stronger with or needing more help, or maybe where do you start?
Yeah, so I think this is well, just like the technology itself and the usability and approachability of the technology. This is changing rapidly, kind of quarter to quarter. I would say 18 months ago, pretty much the only place that we were really seeing AI being used broadly was around AI and fundraising. And my hypothesis around that is that fundraising doesn't look that different from business development or revenue generation in a small and medium-sized for-profit business. And so there's a much longer track record of how machine learning and AI could be used to support business development. There was sort of a clearer one-to-one if you wanted to bring AI or ML into supporting fundraising. And that felt like a pretty clear use case. Again, this is sort of addressing that inspiration gap. Like it was really clear around how I could use AI in fundraising, less clear maybe how I'd use it someplace else. I think one of the real incredible opportunities with generative AI in particular is, it is a general purpose technology. But when a general purpose technology meets every single workflow and the administrative side of your organization or school, as well as the teaching or programmatic side of your nonprofit, it can be a little overwhelming to know where to start. So I think we saw a lot starting in fundraising, but we're seeing more patterns emerge around how it's being used in education and more generally in nonprofits.
That's really interesting to see how that's developing. And when you convened subject matter experts, district leaders, a number of practitioners, you really got a lot of voices at the table talking about this. What surprised you the most about what they said they actually needed versus what the literature, and maybe even especially from an ethical perspective, what that literature was offering them?
So there are two things that I'm going to share with you as a surprise. And one is very people focused, and the other is more about what was the context in which we were developing this work and what people were looking at. But I'm going to start with the people first. We came into it with a very strong point of view that if you wanted to get involved in machine learning or artificial intelligence, that this was not going to be a project that was going to be led and directed out of the technology team. Whatever the technology function was in your organization, this was not a technology project. It was a curriculum project. This was a program project. And so one of the things that we insisted on when we were assembling folks to be subject matter experts and also to be ongoing informants around the development of the framework is we asked them to come in pairs. We said, we need your technology lead, but we need your program lead or your curriculum lead. We also wanted people's MEL leads. And we really encourage folks when they're looking at AI enablement inside of their institutions to think about what is the diversity of perspectives that you need to have at the table to be able to move a project forward. And we really try and underscore it's not just technology. I think one of the things that was really surprising is that for some of those matched pairs that came to us, and we had about 13 organizations with matched pairs that worked with us over about a 6-month period, and we met about 4 or 5 times working through different elements of the framework together. So it was a pretty hands-on and informative development process that often those 2 individuals didn't have a pre-existing working relationship. So they became closer and built a relationship over the course of this project together. But there wasn't necessarily, before they came into the work, a reason why technology was working alongside mission or alongside program or alongside student achievement. And so I think one of the big insights for folks is just this type of work is going to take a village, and you need to think about the diverse set of experiences and expertise you need to have at the table to develop something that's going to have value for your organization. So that's one. The second thing is at the time when we were developing the framework, initially 3 or 4 years ago, the only AI adoption frameworks that were out there were really geared to for-profit companies. And and I think the challenge with for-profit companies is that when everything is trying to drive to profitability, which for us is a little bit like an output, right? But we care about outcomes. So we don't just care that the hours happen in the classroom. We care about, was the knowledge attained, right? That's the actual outcome. And so when the frameworks were all basically driving to, was the tool being used versus did it actually result in something that was different? That meant those frameworks were really falling short of what actually mattered to people who had chosen to dedicate their careers and their lives to education or to the social sector. And in fact, I have a great example of this. We were brought in by a large funder that was doing work around building chatbots with nonprofits who did college access work and then sold those services either into institutions of higher ed or into K-12 school systems. And they had gotten to the end of the project. We were invited to kind of come in for the demo day. And our question was simply, well, did it work? And all of that data that was going to be collected on the back end by using chatbots was simply whether or not students had engaged with the chatbots, not whether or not it had resulted in them completing the FAFSA, not whether or not it increased the opportunity for them to get into school. So again, this sort of short-sightedness, because if you model everything on profitability, you're going to get to outputs, not outcomes. The second thing we saw as more frameworks began to be developed in the sector is that they were living at a really high level kind of theoretical place. So, and in part, I know that's to simplify frameworks, right? You don't want them to be overcomplicated. You want them to help guide people. But what we heard from the nonprofits, from the staff that we were working with, was that if you just say, well, make sure it's ethical, but you don't actually define what that means, it's actually not really helpful to me as a direction setting. So part of what we heard from them was, what's out there right now is too theoretical. I need something that's more practical, that's more actionable.
Well, in the group of the people you interviewed originally, I think it was 34, you had some education leaders, right? Like superintendents. In my interaction, at least, over time, right, there's kind of some different ways people react to it. I think some, like you said, they thought it was just a technology. So it was like more of a question of like, should we add another app, or like, is this like the new smartboard or whatever you want to call it, right? Others kind of saw immediately, all right, this changes or potentially changes everything, about education. Others who kind of like more instructional design, like Dewey-in participatory approaches. They got all excited because they're like, this is our moment, right? And I'm just kind of wondering how, when you interviewed those leaders initially, are those like three buckets that they kind of went into, or are there other buckets? Like
Yeah.
what
I mean, I think,
in terms of reactions?
yeah. And I actually think this is highlighted really well. One of the case studies that we wrote was with Chicago Public Schools, and it really focuses on their entrance into preparing their community for AI. And it looks at both, how do you develop safe and fair practice? How do you develop that sort of policies and best practices? How do you create a foundation for change management? When you think about school districts' entrance with AI, it's really a three areas of focus. So one is squarely where this framework lives, which is for the people I employ. What is the context I'm giving them? What is around how they can use the technology? What is the upskilling that I'm doing? What are the opportunities for efficiencies or opportunities to enhance student achievement? That is around the staff that you actually, well, they're your staff, right? That's the institutional kind of review place that they're interested in. That framework doesn't cover is curriculum, right? And so Lauren Rodriguez, who I'm going to fluff his title, unfortunately, but he basically leads one of the leads of AI adoption at Chicago Public Schools, talks about the fact that kindergartners today are going to graduate from their institution in a very different world requiring different skills. And that if they're not thinking about curriculum design and how they are embedding AI knowledge and use in curriculum, they're really not going to serve those students well, right? Because they have to, when they graduate, they have to be productive. That's one of the options here, right? Joyful, productive, engaged citizenry. And so how do we think about the curriculum piece? The other part that school systems have to think about is what are the rules and guidelines by which I'm asking my student community to use AI, right? Like what are the policies that I'm going to govern how this is, how people are how students are independently using AI. So those are three different areas that are really important to superintendents. This particular framework really focuses on the institutional, like what you actually own, the staff, what you have, kind of complete control over, as opposed to going into curricular design or how do we set up rules and regulations that are relevant to our state regulations around how our student body might interact with AI.
So when you think about that framework and looking at the 8 components and, data readiness, technology implementation, stakeholder engagement, how did you sequence those? And is there a component that organizations almost always underestimate when they're going through the
Yeah.
process?
I think people have really I think in general, this is not just education. I think our society, the way we are talking about AI, we are leaving people completely out of the equation. And the fact that this is a significant shift in the way we are all going to engage with information and engage with technology, and that requires change management. And so I think if there's one real misstep around thinking about AI enablement or AI adoption, it's thinking about the technology first. And we have a little name for that. We call that the shiny object syndrome. Like I'm really excited about this shiny object. How do this is now my new hammer. How do I figure out what could look possibly maybe like a nail? And I want to run around and hit everything. We really encourage people. We actually sequenced what we thought was a reasonable, what needed to happen first, second, and third in this 8-part framework. Technology implementation is the 7th item on that list. There are 6 items before that are not about the technology. It is about your data. It is about your people. And where we ask everybody to start is safe and fair practice. And that is just, even if you are not provisioning AI tools, right? Even if your school district or your organization has decided at this point you're not buying a single license for anybody inside of your institution or organization, you still need to create best practices or a policy around AI use because the tools are available. Pretend that they're not is to really put at peril your intellectual property, privacy of your data, security of your data, and create other risks. So it's purely as a risk mitigation factor, we say, please start by having a conversation about what is the container in which AI is going to be deployed inside of your organization. And within that, we even encourage people to think about whether or not they should be thinking about policies, which are legal documents for which there can be ramifications if they're not followed by your staff, versus best practices. I think the other thing that not every organization or school system thinks about is you have options as to whether or not you want to build best practices, which are guidelines which you'd like people to follow, or policies, which are requirements that people have to follow. And for instance, with Chicago Public Schools, and this is in the case study, they started with guidelines because they were worried that the technology was changing so quickly that they'd have to keep rewriting the policies for governing administrative use and staff use of AI. And so they began with guidelines because they wanted to be able to update it on a quarterly basis, which they have continued to do. Other organizations from the very beginning said, well, we're starting with principles. We know we want to start with something that's legally enforceable if our staff doesn't follow it. The other really exciting thing, though, that again, even if you're not officially deciding to use AI inside of your organization, because you know there's shadow use, that is actually creating the building blocks for you in the future. So you can take note of who are the power users who are using their own licenses, who are using free licenses, again, within the context of your guidelines or policy. You can create open time for people to share how they're using that. That can be a really easy on-ramp in order to understand how are people organically identifying places where there's friction in their work and finding ways for AI to actually reduce that friction and create efficiencies.
Yeah, the one thing, and it's not as directly kind of, related to the document, but obviously you want people to think about this. And, some of that starts with awareness. And, I've told Anand and some other people, sometimes I feel like the town crier AI, AI, and people are like, that's not now, just calm down. Right. So, and then, there's also, this new documentary out about AI. And I saw somebody post on LinkedIn, I went to see this and, hardly anybody there. More people need to show up. Right. So I'm kind of wondering, kind of just generally, if you have some ideas, other than being the town crier about raising awareness, or how do you do it? I definitely
Yeah.
need some advice here because I almost feel like I alienate the people I'm, trying to raise some awareness with. Maybe I'm pushing too hard or something. But how do you approach this building awareness and getting buy-in at the same time?
Yeah. So we call this the all teach, all learn moment. And so I think one of the ways you raise awareness is you lower the bar around things have to be perfect before we can share. If things have to be perfect before we can share, we're not going to be sharing anything very soon. And I think, one of the real benefits of when AI first came into the education and the nonprofit sector, there was a lot of big dollars in resources that were placed by the large technology companies because they wanted to see how their technology could be used in education and in the social sector. And while that is, hugely beneficial because it created some of the first test beds around that, the knowledge that was captured and shared back out to the community was kind of brand halo, right? It was all perfect. And why wouldn't it be perfect? You had engineers that you couldn't possibly buy on the open market, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think part of this is being willing to share what's working and what's not working. And so, part of the documentation around 5 case studies, all focused, with the exception of one on education organizations within elements of this framework, was to try and show how things unfolded over time. What were the mistakes that were made? What was the backtracking that had to happen? Quill.org talked about using non-generative AI when they first began creating writing prompts and supporting writing of strong sentences for students. That's the product that they have in the market. And then at some point, that was all based on prompting versus generative AI. At some point, there was a big technology shift, and they had to walk away from millions of dollars of investment, as well as thousands of hours of work time. And that's documented in our case study about what it meant to say, that's actually not, that absolutely incredible learning brought us to where we are today, isn't going to bring us to where we are next. So I think part of being the town crier is being able to finding people who are willing to share what the process looks like, what the journey is looking like, as opposed to only sharing, I've got this perfect thing. I think we all know perfection isn't possible, and it is highly improbable when the technology is going to keep changing dramatically, sort of quarter over quarter. We are all going to be in an ongoing learning process. I think that's actually one of the things that we emphasize in the Equitable AI Adoption Framework around culture of learning and managing change is really, how do you embrace ongoing AI training? How do you embrace continuous learning? How do you encourage shared learning? How do you manage change? I think, one of the interesting things about the change management process right now for institutions and organizations is there's no end in sight. And I can't remember, maybe it feels like COVID, right? When we had no end in sight. What does it mean to be in a state of constantly reevaluating and changing what you're doing? And how do you support a community around being a part of what feels like it's going to be perpetual change for the foreseeable future?
Now, you're really intentional about the process. I would imagine you're equally intentional about the language you're using about this. You put equitable right in the title. It's not in the fine print. How do you operationalize equity in AI adoption programs, I think in general, but also how do you do that when many organizations are still trying to figure out what equity means for their non-AI programs?
Right. Again, we're not going to wait for perfection. So I think, again, because we ask you to start at safe and fair practice, and one of the things we ask you to look at is identifying your mission, your equity commitment, your values, anything else that would inform your legal policies or best practice guidelines for responsible AI. So we presume that you've done some work as an institution. I think when people get really scared about bias in AI, and I love the fact that you're comparing this to what are we doing offline in addition to what are we doing online, because I think people get scared and bias in AI as if the bias in AI is not the bias that we've always seen, which is human bias, right? It can be scaled in such a dramatic manner with AI because of the scalability of the work. And if you're not setting up safeguards for it, because the output of AI can look so professional, right? It looks so good. It looks so professional. It has the buzzwords that you may not interrogate it the same way that you would think to interrogate a conversation. I mean that in a positive, non-aggressive way, like that you question, that you're in inquiry mode, policy or question or other learning that maybe is brought to you, that doesn't sort of come through generative AI. I think, I've had the pleasure over the last 5 years of building a number of different frameworks concerning AI and machine learning. And I think one of the things that I've always really struggled with in trying to articulate equity and bias in the context of AI is it its own category Or do you need to weave it all the way through? And where we really came out is that equity has to be a consideration at every single step. So it's a consideration when you're thinking about your safe and fair practice policies. It's a consideration when you're thinking about your data, what you're collecting and what you're not collecting. We are very, very positive and proactive about recommending stakeholder engagement. That could be just your staff, the diversity of staff you have on your team, or it goes beyond to the communities that you serve. If you're not engaging stakeholders, you're not going to know whether or not what you think is a real problem is actually a problem that they feel, whether or not the way you want to collect and use data to be able to solve that problem using machine learning and AI is actually data that they're willing to give or data that they believe is important. So if you leave your stakeholders out of this conversation, the likelihood that bias is going to come in because you're trying to do something for people but not with people creeps up. And so making sure stakeholder engagement is a big part of the work, really thinking about how you're designing for outcomes. For that, we really encourage people to think about how you're going to use AI to support your evaluation, how you're going to use your models to drive program improvement. We've heard stories from organizations early on in the machine learning journey that despite everybody's best intentions, because it is staffed by human beings, there's still a difference around how are being distributed across a population of folks. And that's going to be true in a school system as well. And so part of what you might learn in doing early stage development of AI augmentation or automation of different tools is you might learn that, in fact, despite best intentions, despite hiring wonderful people, despite all of your training, that maybe the good stuff isn't getting to everybody who needs it. Having some sort of container in order to be able to have that conversation internally is important. And that container means you've done some work as an organization to talk openly about bias and equity inside your organization. It's really hard to have those conversations only if they're part of technology, right? Because the technology might be bringing up where bias exists in your system. Ideally, you have some language, and it's not punitive. It is with a learning frame of we're all here to do better. We're all here to serve. How do we get better?
You talked about, stakeholders, which, often, donors or, there can be other types of stakeholders, but, that's a large category. Have you started seeing anything where they are kind of asking questions about, any of these things, right? Like whether it's, okay, have you taken efforts, to protect your data, organize your data and improve your operations with AI to improve your grant writing capabilities? Are you seeing kind of emerging like interests in these stakeholders kind of asking the nonprofits what at least we probably don't have huge expectations at this stage, but what might they be doing?
Right. Well, certainly at the beginning of the generative AI wave, I think there was a big concern in school systems about whether or not generative AI would be used for cheating. I think among philanthropic foundations, there was a big concern that generative AI would be used to write grant applications, which was really interesting because at the same time, you saw a wave of philanthropic foundations experimenting with generative AI themselves for synthesizing grant applications. So I think we have to come to some conclusions. I want to separate the conversation that's around brain development and adolescent brain development and how writing actually informs brain development from the writing has long been used as a gatekeeping mechanism in our society. Who decides what is well written? And how does generative AI potentially become a leveling support tool across our society for written communication? So I think there's an interesting ongoing debate about how generative AI writing shows up across the board. I think the thing that I've found sort of more interesting and hopeful, and I'm gonna reference a case study we wrote here on Talking Points and the Aurora Public School District in Colorado. Talking Points does like text-based translation software across, I think it's like over 150 languages at this point. So teachers can just write a text message to a family can respond in their own language. They've made a very sophisticated translation engine, so they know when you say sub, you're not referring to a submarine or a sub sandwich. You actually need a substitute teacher. And this is obviously standing on top of decades of research about family engagement with teachers, how that actually ultimately improves student attendance and student outcomes. So in the depths of COVID, Aurora Public Schools, because they had so much they needed to communicate to families, rolled out talking points across its district. And as they were coming back in from COVID, Aurora was no different from many school districts and had a really terrible absenteeism problem. And what some teachers realized is that they could not figure out what was happening with the absenteeism, but they knew if they sent a text to the family through talking points, they were going to get a response. And so you started to have attendance administration folks basically using talking points instead of teachers as a way to try and figure out what was happening with the absenteeism. And talking points was seeing this across their system because they were monitoring the messages. And they came to Aurora and said, it seems like you really need a solution for this. And so what ended up happening was a partnership between Aurora Public Schools and talking points to ultimately build out a whole absenteeism module that is geared towards the administrative offices, trying to quickly surface patterns around what's happening with absenteeism. Who are the folks that are chronic? Who are the folks that it's one-off? More importantly, are there different decisions that they can make in order to correct for absenteeism? So they've changed bus routes, which has improved absenteeism. They've been able to make structural changes that have had material impact on absenteeism. So I think the thing that's really exciting is that when you have that much data, and for talking points, they have over, I think it's several billion conversations that they have at this point that they can look at the data. So it's really allows them to begin co-developing with their stakeholders to build tools that are meaningful and drive impact and outcomes for the communities that they serve. That's what's exciting to me.
Higher education is also struggling with, AI in ways that K-12 is, in ways that feel both urgent and unresolved, to academic integrity, something you touched on a moment ago, to institutional strategy. I know that the framework is really designed with K-12 in mind. Do you think this framework could travel upward into colleges and universities? Would it need some type of translation? What would be the next steps to be able to glean so much from what you've been able to do with this framework and be able to take it to higher ed?
So I would welcome that conversation. What I would want to do is make it participatory. I mean, this is such a core tenet of who Project Evident is. We are practitioner-centric. We do all of our work. We don't consider ourselves experts that sort of sit on the side and then divine something and then put it back into the sector. We try and build everything that's actionable, practical, and in community. So I would say I would take this to a group of higher ed that was interested in this. And again, I would want diverse perspectives from those institutions, not just the head of technology and not just the dean of academics. I would want to then be in dialogue using this as a baseline and saying, what would we change? What would you add? What would you modify? What would you delete? What feels incredibly important for your community? What's missing here? I think that's the way in this all teach, all learn moment, we have a very human experience about how we want the technology to be brought into our communities and what do we need to consider? What are the steps we need to take to make sure it's done in a way that has integrity and value?
Excellent.
Yeah. And, I think that just in terms of, trying to kind of actualize it. So how do you kind of work with I know, you have the report, right? You have the framework, like what are some steps you take to actualize this or, in any way, right? From, something super concrete to just kind of where you try to get the organizations to move.
Yeah. So on our website, not only will you find the Equitable AI Adoption Framework, but for each level of the framework, you will see a whole set of resources. Those resources could be the case study, it could be a podcast for further listening and learning. It could actually be a session recording with subject matter experts and practitioners from the Equitable AI Adoption Framework conference that we held earlier in 26. But there also will be tools and resources that we've culled from across the sector to help people begin to think about what's a template I could use to walk through a conversation inside my own organization. How do I map my workflows? How do I build a policy? What does that look like? So we have a whole set of tools that you can allow yourself to self-guide. We also run cohorts. We typically do this in partnership with a philanthropic funder. Often they're centered around a particular domain, and we do AI adoption around a set of what are shared challenges because of similar program models, similar institutions. And we really support how do you build your AI strategy and how do you move towards AI adoption in a pilot across one of these shared challenges. And those cohorts typically unfold over the course of 6 months. We like to think that the individualized coaching, the training, the exposure to others that are slightly ahead of you, that those are all sort of ideal for adult learning. I will tell you that what comes back to us again and again is the community that is created through the community of practice, that being able to wrestle with this with your peers is what people really is enduring for folks, that they do not feel alone in the work. And I think in a moment where there's a lot of fear of missing out with AI, a fear of being left behind, it can still feel really isolating in terms of what you as an individual, what your institution is trying to do. So whether it's with a cohort with us, with a cohort with another set of organizations or another funder, or even if it's just reaching out to your peers that you have, the friendships that you've created in your sector, just informally ask, what are you doing? What is the experience like? And to not sort of sit in uncertainty by yourself. You do not have to do that. Please reach out to those around you.
What I really appreciate about the approach that you've highlighted a number of times in this conversation is the collaboration, the focus on relationships and, the human role within the process. So it's not jump to the technology first. We'll get to that. But how do you set this process up so that we're thoughtful about that community building and the work that's being done? And so appreciative of this discussion. Sarah, tell us, for anybody that's watching, if they want to find out more about Project Evident, about the Equitable AI Framework, where can they go? How can they find out about this? And how can they get involved?
Absolutely. Well, come to our website. It's projectevident.org. Within that, I focus on the outcomes AI practice, and you'll see we have a tool for you to be able to look at the Equitable AI Adoption Framework. Again, it has all those additional resources, including the case studies and podcasts and recordings of the deeper dive sessions from our conference, as well as templates, additional reading, and other tools that you can use to make progress against any of the 8 areas of the Equitable AI Adoption Framework. What I'd love to leave people with is we often invert the idea of people often talk about human in the loop. We say technology in the loop. The predominant way that we operate in education and in the nonprofit sector is human to human. So we look for ways that you can bring technology into the human loop, as opposed to saying everything is going to be technology and how do we make sure that humans are still a part of it. So when you start your AI journey, it's going to make sure it remains human and know that you are in the driver's seat. This is human, and you might want to add some technology to the human loop.
I love that. That is something I'm going to be sharing widely, and I'll try to remember to credit you for it, Sarah. But I really love the emphasis on the human-to-human relationship and bringing AI in instead of human in the loop. It's like the humans are the add-in afterthought. That's fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
What an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.